Hi everybody, welcome to Evolution. So this is chapter 27 in our Inquiry into Life textbook. And in this chapter we're going to go over how evolution occurs, though we don't know what actually stimulated the production of the first cells. We do have some hypotheses, so we'll talk about those hypotheses, and then we're going to focus on once that cell was produced, how evolution actually occurs. So when you look at the Earth, our Earth is super old. And actually I have a picture on the next slide that I'll show you, okay? There you go. So the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, but life didn't actually start, or we don't have record of life until about 3.5 billion years. So the Earth was around a lot longer, for a billion years longer than we actually have living things. The first eukaryotic life, and remember, prokaryotic, pre-nucleus, they don't have that nucleus, they are single-celled organisms all the time. Eukaryotic life didn't start until about 2.1 billion years ago. And then multicellular life is estimated to be about 700 million years old only. So down here you can see the different levels of life, and humans are just at the very end of this entire process. So we have not been around for very long at all. We are just a little blip on the time scale. So once living things started being produced, then evolution started occurring. So how did the first cells come about? We are not sure. I mean, there's nobody that can say for sure how this occurred. It could have occurred on land or in the ocean. It likely caused different molecules to come together, forming the first organic molecules. And as they formed, larger organic molecules like macromolecules may have formed, and then eventually they came together forming a pre or proto cell. So there's an experiment that was done in the 50s by Miller and Urey. And what they did was they hypothesized that small organic molecules could be produced if there was the right inorganic materials and if there was some strong energy source that occurred, like maybe a lightning strike would be an example of a strong energy source. So they actually did this experiment, and so here is the animation for the experiment. And so do I want to show it? I'm going to have you watch this animation on your own. The only reason is because sometimes when you watch an animation within a video, like a PowerPoint like this, the animation doesn't come out as easy. So what I would like you to do is take a moment and watch the animation right now, and then jump back on this video. So just pause this video, open up your PowerPoint on the internet, and then click the animation, okay? So whatever actually stimulated this reaction or this process, we know that at some point living cells existed. And, nobody can be 100% in explaining how that occurred. But from that time, we then know that evolution was able to start. As soon as we had the first real cells that were living, then evolution occurs. So a true cell is a membrane-bound structure that carries that can carry out different processes like protein synthesis and DNA replication, and then can produce new cells. So once that first true cell formed, then biological evolution began and we started to see changes. So evolution in a nutshell is just all of the changes that have occurred in the life of organisms since the beginning of life. And this process occurs due to differential reproductive success. So certain organisms are more likely to be able to reproduce than other organisms. The reason this occurs is because organisms are better suited to an environment. So if the environment favors one group of organisms, they're going to be able to reproduce easier than another group. So this evolution then shows how the first cells eventually gave rise to different cells and eventually gave rise to living things that we think of, like, or not living things that we think of, gave rise to animals and plants and fungi. So we have all these different groups of organisms, not just the bacteria or those single-celled organisms that we started out with. So how do we know that evolution occurs? There's a lot of different evidences, so we're going to go through each evidence just briefly so that you get the idea of what is going on. Fossil evidence is the hard bodies of organisms have been preserved within different strata of rock. The older strata are lower than the younger strata, so rock forms, and newer rock is going to be laid above the older rock. And so this gives us an idea of when that body was found, or when that body died, and when those fossils were basically deposited into the rock. So how old that is. We have transitional fossils that allow us to see links between older and newer organisms. So the most common transitional fossil that we typically talk about, or the one that I know best, is called Archaeopteryx, which kind of brings the bird, the natural bird that we all know, and dinosaurs together. So most people now, can identify birds are winged dinosaurs. So they follow that path, and they are so like the dinosaurs that they are winged dinosaurs. And Archaeopteryx was a dinosaur that had wings, but the wings actually had feathers just like our birds do. So here you can see how rock forms. Hey, dogs. Sorry, I have dogs in here that are all excited because they got new beds brought up for them. So here you can see how the rocks form as sediment comes into, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong mouse. As sediment comes into the river, it forms layers, and as that layer gets packed down, eventually it forms a rock or a sedimentary layer of rock. Animals that are in this rock die, or that are in this water here, when they die, they settle to the ground, and as more sediments flow over, the bodies actually of those organisms get packed in with the sediment and eventually become part of the sedimentary rock themselves. And so anything down here is going to be older than any of the newer stuff up here. And here you have Archaeopteryx, which I just talked about, with the feathers, but yet the definite dinosaur skin and scales and teeth up here. We have biogeographical evidence, which biogeography is the study of the distribution of organisms throughout the world. And we can look at different areas of the world and how the earth has shifted, and we see that there are similar organisms in two different continents, because at one point those continents were together. And so the organisms could all live on that one continent. And as the continents shifted, the organisms also were pulled apart. And so we might have the same organism on two different continents. And when they died, their fossils were identified in those two different continents. That's known as continental drift, when the continents pulled apart. And so here you see Pangea, where all the continents were put together. Here is Laurasia. The continents are starting to separate, but they have not separated completely. If you look really closely, though, the one continent that separates furthest from all the others is Australia. It's the first continent to separate completely. And if you look on Australia versus all the other continents, they have some of the most unique organisms. So it's really kind of interesting. Here we have the Cretaceous period. We have those continents that are pretty well separated. And then here we have present day and how the Earth looks. If this animation here shows the continental drift, again, I'm not going to show you this because I don't want to play the animations and have them not work, but definitely stop the video and play that animation. It'll help you understand continental drift. So I just mentioned that Australia has some of the most unique mammals or animals. So their mammals are marsupials, and so these are examples of marsupials. Marsupials are mammals that are born before, so they're underdeveloped. They can't survive on their own yet. So when they are born, they then move into a little pouch in mom's, or in a little pouch that mom has, and mom carries them in that pouch for a few months before they can actually move out on their own. The rest of the world has mainly placental mammals, and a placental mammal is born able to survive on its own. That doesn't mean that it doesn't need help from mom and dad, but it can survive. It has all the organs that function and allow it to survive on its own. And then we have anatomical evidence. Anatomical evidence is evidence that shows how the anatomy has changed through time. There's homologous structures. These are structures that have the same basic function, and the structure is basically the same. So the forelimbs of a vertebrate, they have basically the same function in all vertebrates. That would be an example of a homologous structure. If you look closely, and I'm going to just quickly go to the next slide so you can see this. If you look closely at multiple vertebrates, you can see that we all have that large upper arm bone, known as the humerus. We have two different lower arm bones, and again, you can see those. Those would be the ulna and radius. We have a bunch of bones that are our wrist bones or our carpals, and then we have all of the finger bones. I'm going to go quickly back so I can talk about analogous structures. Analogous structures are structures that don't have or weren't produced out of common ancestry, but instead were produced because the organisms had the same common environment or needed that same common environment. So an example here would be like the wings of a bird and the wings of an insect. There's no commonality, there's no common, how do I say it? The structures themselves are not at all alike. The wings of an insect are not composed of any types of bones. they actually they're very, very thin, what we call like veins that hold those structures out. And birds have bones in their wings, but they both have the same function. In this case, they both function in flying. So the origins differ, but they are the same in their function. And that's what an analogous structure is. And I just showed you this. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Here you can see the analogous structures. Birds and bats have homologous structures, the same structures, but totally different organisms. Whereas both birds and bats have analogous structures to the insect. The insect does not have any bones. They have these little veins that hold their wing tissue together, but they all function for the same process, getting into that sky. A vestigial structure then is a structure that is a remnant of probably an important structure in the past. So an example are the hind legs of the whale. Whales don't come out on land anymore, but they do still have those bones. Examples of vestigial structures in humans. We have that tailbone, the coccyx. The tailbone still does have some important functions in that it holds the muscles for defecation. But if we didn't have it, I'm sure those muscles would be attached somewhere else. The tailbone itself, though, is no longer producing a tail for the human. So that would be considered a vestigial structure. We have other vestigial structures as well, but that's an example. And here's another picture of an animal. This is an emu who has wings, but the wings don't really have the same function. Emus can't fly, so their wings are basically just tiny little structures that kind of look pretty, but that's it. All right, I'm going to stop this video because it's already at 17 minutes, and we'll go on to anatomical evidence, looking at the comparative embryology, looking at growth, and then we'll talk about biological evidence in the next video, okay? Bye.